I actually was an unusual child in that respect. I very early in my life, probably through reading, more probably through being in a working class community in Queens, in during the Depression years, I very early acquired an interest in workers and social justice. I had lived for a time when my father returned from the Second World War. I lived for a year in a very small town in Virginia where I experienced Jim Crow firsthand. And I was only 6 or 7 years old, but it had an enormous impact on me and really changed the way I thought. And kind of, I guess, from that period out, I just pursued my activist interests, though I had no formed politics. I was a child. I just knew that I felt strongly about social issues. I would say that the thing that there were two things that made me realize one could make a life and a career in social activism. One was the war in Vietnam, and the entire 60s and 70s culture that developed around protest movements of that time. I I went to the Vietnam Peace Parade Committee knowing nothing, knowing I just wanted to do whatever needed to be done to enable protests to happen. I never thought of myself as a leader, so I went there to sweep the floors or lick the stamps or whatever. And of course, became very engaged quickly in a community that valued discussion and learning as much as anything else. And then the second thing, and so I became very active in the anti-war movement and somewhat so in the developing women's movement as well. And then um, I spent a year in France. My ex-husband was a Fulbright scholar, and we watched all of the civil rights activities going on in the South on French television. And it
Mm.
was the most amazing experience, both of isolation. What am I doing here? Why am I not in my country? Why am I not in the thick of this? And also, a kind of way of understanding it from a distance. But when we got back in, I guess it was August 1963, and we went directly to Washington for the Great March, the Civil Rights March for Jobs and
Mhm.
Justice. And it changed my life. That day changed my life. I said, "There's, I can participate in this. I can do something." I had not yet come to the idea that I could become a union activist. That hadn't occurred to me yet, but it did occur to me that I could now make some kind of some choices that would uh, bring me closer to social movements. Um, it was the most remarkable day in the world, and I think I'm almost going to cry thinking about it. And I think the most remarkable part of that day was not Dr. King's speech, which was spectacular and unforgettable, but driving into the city. And as the buses came in, there were hundreds and hundreds of people, African Americans, from whatever part of town we came in through, on the street, waving the buses on. And I was extraordinary. I had never experienced anything like this. I had never been part of anything like that. So I would say that that day pretty clearly and very definitively changed my life and changed the way I thought about myself in relationship to the world. Um, and then I was in the publishing industry, which perhaps that was the work I did after I graduated from college. And I soon came to realize that publishing workers were extraordinarily exploited, particularly the women. The men held all the glamorous jobs, the editors who worked with all the great writers, and the women, we did the cleanup work, the copy editing. Very few of us were really influential editors or allowed to participate at that level of negotiation in the business. And we were terribly low paid. You have no idea. So I was in a women's group, consciousness raising group, in 1976, 75. And one of the women in my group worked for the publishing company Harper and Row. And she said, I can't come to the next few meetings. We have negotiations. And I said, negotiations for what? And she said, well, we have a union contract. We're not in a national union, we're a house union. We're thinking about affiliating to a national union, but we're in negotiations. I said, can I come? She said, no. So a few weeks later, they went out on strike. And I said, I'm going to go to the picket line, show my support, because by that time, I really felt that we were extraordinarily exploited and needed unions as much as any factory worker or retail worker or any other kind of worker that was in a union. So I went to the picket line, and then I started bringing colleagues from other publishing houses to the picket line. And we kept a list. And when the strike was over, Harper and Row called us all together to a meeting. They said they were thinking about affiliating now to a national union. And what did we want to do? And the first thing we did was we went around the room and we told everybody our salaries. Um, and that did it.
You
You
were
know,
all full-time workers.
we were all full time workers. I will tell you that my first job at Esquire magazine as a proofreader, I was a kid straight out of college in 1961. I earned $55 a week and no health benefits at all. So so our salaries had gone up a little by the 70s, but not a whole lot. And so when I made $125, I was classified as an executive when I finally reached that awesome amount of $125. So by that time, I'm already thinking that um, we really need a union. And so I was managing editor at this point of the pocketbooks division of Simon and Schuster. And the president of the company sent all the department heads a memo saying how they could calculate raises for their department, what percent of the total wage you could give. And so I started calculating it and I said, well, if I give a better raise to so and so because they're so great at their job, I have to stiff so and so. So I took myself out of the calculation. It still didn't work. Merit just did not work. So I said, okay, I'm giving everybody the same raise, and that's that. And that was for me the moment that I said, we're going to have a union here. So we did. The committee that had formed out of the Harper and Row strike after a union search. I always wanted it to be District 65 because I knew 65ers from the anti-war movement. Anyway, we did affiliate with 65, and David Livingston, the president, said, choose somebody from your ranks to come on the staff to organize. I got elected. And that's how. That's the trajectory that brought me into the labor movement and into the movement, and then specifically into the labor movement.
And into a lot of other related movements
Yes,
as well.
yes, of course. And then after that, I learned not so quickly. I wasn't so smart. I was a very innocent kid. Mike Livingston used to call me a green tomato because I had very strange idealistic ideas with very little grounding in the real world. So it took me a while to learn, but I did. And I quickly began to understand the relationship of the labor movement to larger movements for social justice. I think that's an important thing that we were able to learn in District 65 because it was that kind of a union. It was very much a part of the movement of social unionism, and it was a left-wing union. It wasn't much. It wasn't so left anymore by the time I got there, but it still had some shimmer of its left-wing history.
So
And so,
when you say a social union, tell us what you mean by that.
well,
People who don't know.
District 65 to provide an example of social unionism followed the belief that the union uh, was there to care for, not so much to care for, but to support the whole worker, not just to negotiate a wage or a health benefit, but to think about quality of life issues, to think about education, to include in union negotiations education benefits, which it did, to think about cultural activities, which it did. The history of District 65 was a very interesting example of a union that had a food cooperative, a clothing cooperative, a health delivery service, dental service rather, on site where people actually went to the dentist at the union. Um,
And
it had
sports and
sports too.
social
Oh, sure, and it had a
activities.
nightclub. It was a very famous nightclub. Some very famous people started there, including Harry Belafonte, Ossie Davis, and other people who came and performed at the Club 65. I believe it was called. It was called Club 65. And so it had a very holistic approach to its relationship to workers and a very deep belief, which in later years was honored in the breach, but in still when I came, there was a strong belief in rank and file participation. And there was, I will tell one story that I think everybody should know. Um, there was a period, I was not yet at the union, but there was a period when District 65 was trying to organize its shops, trying to integrate its shops. And it had a hiring hall. And David Livingston went to the general council of the union, which was all the delegates, the shop stewards, and the unit chairs, and so on, and proposed that the hiring hall would send that um, seniority be suspended temporarily, and that the hiring hall send only black workers to every job opening that came through. And at first, the delegates voted against it. And he went back a second time to the delegates and you know made his persuasive speech, and it was voted on. It passed. And so for months, the union suspended seniority, sent only black workers. The employers kept sending them back. The union kept sending them more black workers until finally the employers got the message, and a considerable um, improvement was made. I mean, it didn't solve the problem entirely, obviously, but it broke some ground. And I think that's one of the most interesting stories about District 65 that illustrates both its very progressive, uh, uh, for that time, quite left perspective, and also uh, uh, its devotion to social unionism. So it was an interesting place, and of course they had an education program which I became very much involved in my later years in the union.
Did you find ways to bring your feminist commitments to your work?
Interesting story.
How complicated was that?
Interesting story. District 65 had quite a number of well known, or at least within the union, women leaders when the men, this is a typical story, when the men were overseas during the war. And as soon as the men came back, the women were, reassigned to their lower positions, more or less. There were a few women in decent positions in the union, not many. And I was, I think, the second or third, no, I was the third woman hired in a new wave of organization, which was directed at white collar offices, uh, legal offices, universities, museums, and publishing, in my case. And so the union hired a bunch of women because those professions were very female intensive. And so Bernice Krozik from Harper and Row was the first. Well, she was not the first. Marge Albert, who was a very, 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 she was my mentor, a very wonderful woman. Marge Albert, Ellen Harper, Bernice, and then me, and then Julie Kushner,
Yeah.
uh, and a few other people. And at some point, we said, we really have to do something. We need a women's committee in this union, not just for ourselves, for the staff, but for the members. We need a women's committee. So we went to the officers of the union and we said, we'd like to propose forming a women's committee. So David says, you don't need a women's committee. A worker is a worker. We don't make distinctions between women and men workers. So we said, but you have a Black Affairs Committee. Oh, that's different. And so we said, why is it different? And we badgered and badgered and badgered, and we won. And we got ourselves the first women's committee in the union. And that was, Julie was there, I think, already. So that had to be like 1978, perhaps, that we were able to do that. But
I,
it was a big struggle.
I wanted to end by asking you if you have advice for young activists or something you want to tell the next generation or two about what you've learned in terms of making a difference.
Oh my goodness. It's a big, big question. I have to say to any young person that I feel as though I have made a small contribution to social justice, and that has been meant everything to me. To know that I have made a small contribution, and that um, I think I think there isn't any higher calling really than to um, be part of the social justice movement. Doesn't have to be the labor movement; can be many, many movements. We're all connected in many ways, but I think that um, it's to me, it's been the highest calling of my life. I've done a lot of different things, and I will always feel that I'm an organizer in my heart, even though I haven't organized a worker. Oh well, that's not true since NYU. That's 20 years ago. Um, I think that's one thing. That it is a very. The other thing is we're living in such terrible times, really terrible times, and at the same time, we're learning so much out of these terrible experiences, and we're seeing so clearly the ravages of economic inequality and racism. And there's so many opportunities, and I think there is some opening, a reopening, and of interest and some new passion developing among young people about making social change. And I think this is a good time, despite how awful these times are. I think this is a good time to find yourself in a community of like-minded social activists to make change. I mean, I actually believe that the labor movement will be moving ahead a little bit in the next little while. I think there are signs of that. I think um, certainly questions around racism, around economic inequality are just burst wide open. And there's lots to do. There's a huge amount to do. Um, and there's opportunities. And I think if I were talking to a young person today, I would say, frankly, I don't think you can find a better way to live in the world than to uh, make a commitment, to make even a small contribution to changing the world. I think, I don't know, to me, it has been everything. So.